The rain in Western Europe never just falls. It bleeds into the concrete, turning the world into a monochromatic blur of wet asphalt and heavy, gray fog. It was 12:45 a.m. Nihal stood under the rusting skeletal frame of a desolate highway bus shelter, somewhere on the jagged outskirts of the city. His breath bloomed into small, ragged clouds of white mist in the freezing air. His smartphone had died 20 minutes ago, a useless slab of black glass in his pocket. He was entirely alone, or at least he felt that way, until the headlights appeared. They didn't cut through the fog. They dissolved into it, casting an unstable, sickly yellow aura across the road. The vehicle that groaned to a halt before him was an archaic, dilapidated transit bus. Its chassis was coated in a layer of grime so thick it looked like decaying skin, and its engine emitted a low, rhythmic thrum, a sound less like machinery and more like a dying animal gasping for air. The pneumatic door hissed open with a dry, screeching complaint. No conductor stood at the precipice. No voice welcomed him. Driven by the biting cold, Nihal stepped inside. The interior was bathed in a dim, suffocating neon blue light that flickered in synchronicity with the engine's erratic heartbeat. The air inside smelled faintly of ozone, wet wool, and something old, like the damp earth of a freshly dug grave. Near the front, 3 or 4 passengers sat completely motionless. They were slumped over, their chins pressed tight against their chests, their figures shrouded in the deep shadows of the high-backed seats. They didn't look up as he passed. They didn't even seem to breathe. Nihal kept his head down, walking past them to the absolute rear of the bus. He chose the last window seat on the right. He pulled his damp jacket tighter around himself, jammed his dead headphones over his ears, just to block out the oppressive silence of the cabin, and leaned his temple against the cold, vibrating glass of the window. Outside, the dark, skeletal shapes of pine trees whipped past, swallowed almost instantly by the shifting fog. The rhythmic, hypnotic swaying of the bus began to pull him under. His eyelids grew heavy, but just as the border between waking and dreaming began to blur, A sound brought him violently back to reality. Top, top, top. It was a sharp, brittle sound, like bone striking glass. Nihal opened his eyes, his heart taking a sudden, erratic leap in his chest. He pulled the headphones down around his neck, listening intently. The bus was hurtling down the empty highway at 60 miles per hour. Top, top, top. It was coming from his right, directly against his window pane. Slowly, his muscles locking with terror, Nihal turned his gaze toward the dark glass. At first, there was only his own pale, hollow reflection staring back. But then, as the bus passed beneath a flickering, isolated streetlight, the reflection vanished. Pressed flat against the outside of the speeding bus was a hand. It was human in shape, but horribly wrong. The skin was a translucent, waterlogged white, peeling at the knuckles, and the fingernails were split down the middle, caked with dark mud. The fingers were actively scratching at the glass, leaving faint, oily smudges behind. And behind the hand, floating effortlessly in the roaring wind outside, was a face. It had no features, no nose, no lips, just two wide, hollow sockets filled with a swirling, static blue smoke that stared directly into Nihal's soul. Nihal choked back a scream, throwing himself sideways across the aisle. His breath came in ragged, desperate gasps. He blinked hard, squeezing his eyes shut, forcing his rational brain to scream that it was an illusion, a hallucination born of exhaustion. When he forced his eyes open, the window was empty. Only the oily smudges remained on the glass, slowly blurring under the pouring rain. Before he could even process the horror, the bus violently slammed its brakes. The tires shrieked against the wet tarmac, throwing Nihal forward against the seat in front of him. The bus had stopped dead on top of an old, arched stone bridge over a black, rushing river. The silence returned, heavier than before. Up ahead, one of the silent passengers slowly rose from their seat. They didn't turn around. They began to walk down the aisle toward the exit doors. But as the figure passed beneath the flickering blue cabin light, Nihal's blood turned to pure ice. The passengers' clothes were dry, but their limbs moved with a sickening, disjointed jerk, as if their bones had been shattered and put back together incorrectly. Their knees bent backward with every step. As the entity reached the middle aisle, it stopped. It didn't turn its head toward Nihal, but its jaw dropped open, and a voice, layered, hollow, and completely devoid of human inflection, leaked out into the quiet cabin. When the next station comes, do not open the glass. The doors hissed open. The figure stepped out into the blinding fog and vanished into the night. The pneumatic doors hissed shut again, the sound cutting through the damp air like a final gasp. The bus lurched forward, its ancient engine groaning as it rolled off the stone bridge and back into the suffocating embrace of the fog. Nihal remained frozen. Across the aisle, his knuckles white, as he gripped the metal frame of the seat opposite his own. His heart was hammering, a frantic, erratic rhythm against his ribs. He looked down the aisle. The remaining 2 passengers hadn't moved an inch. They sat like statues, faces buried in the shadows of their high-backed seats, completely indifferent to the disjointed thing that had just exited the vehicle. Slowly, purely driven by a sickening necessity to confirm his own sanity, Nihal crawled back onto his seat. He forced his eyes toward the window pane. The face was gone, but the oily smudges left by those split, mud-caked fingernails were still there, glistening faintly under the pale blue light of the cabin. They hadn't faded. The rain outside was washing over the glass, but the marks were on the outside, slowly distorting, but stubbornly remaining. He pulled his legs up onto the seat, pressing his back hard against the opposite corner, trying to put as much distance between himself and the glass as possible. The bus began to descend a steep, winding incline. The highway signs flashing past were rusted and faded, the European route numbers scrubbed away by time or intent. This wasn't a route Nihal recognized. He had lived in this region for 3 years, yet the landscape outside felt entirely alien, denser, darker. the pine trees crowding the edges of the tarmac like silent, towering sentinels. Then, the bus began to slow down once more. Up ahead, a lone structure emerged from the mist. It was a concrete transit station, brutalist in design, looking more like a forgotten bunker than a place for commuters. A single, naked bulb hung from a frayed wire outside, pulsing with a weak, sickly orange glow. The bus came to a halt. The brakes shrieked, a high-pitched wail that made Nihal cover his ears. PSSTTTTT. The front doors didn't open this time. Instead, the small speaker above Nihal's head crackled to life with a burst of heavy, aggressive static. Through the white noise, a voice drifted out dry, monotonous, and distant, like an old recording being played from deep underground. Station 4, Blackwood Hollow. Passengers for the crossing, prepare your toll. Nihal's breath hitched. He looked toward the front. One of the remaining passengers, a figure wearing a heavy, dark trench coat, slowly began to stand up. But as the figure straightened, Nihal realized with a jolt of horror that the person's proportions were entirely wrong. The torso was impossibly long, stretching upward until the head was forced to tilt sideways against the ceiling of the bus. The fabric of the coat shifted, and for a fraction of a second, Nihal caught a glimpse of what lay beneath. It wasn't a human body. It was a shifting, chaotic mass of dark, geometric shards, like a living sculpture made of broken black glass, vibrating with a low, subaudible hum. The tall entity didn't walk down the aisle. It glided, its movements fluid and silent, completely defying the physical laws of a moving vehicle. As it drew closer to the rear, the temperature inside the cabin plummeted. The air became so cold that Nihal's breath instantly froze into a thick, white cloud. The entity stopped right next to Nihal's row. It didn't have a face, but Nihal could feel an intense, crushing pressure focusing entirely on him. The static hum emitting from the creature's glass-like form was deafening now, vibrating through the metal floorboards and directly into the soles of his shoes. Slowly, a long, segmented arm made of dark, interlocking crystalline shards raised from beneath the trench coat. It didn't point at the exit, pointed directly at the window next to Nihal. Open it. A chorus of whispers echoed inside Nihal's mind, bypassing his ears entirely. The air outside is waiting. Open the glass. Nihal remembered the warning of the first passenger, the one with the backward limbs. Do not open the glass. He squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head violently. No, he choked out, his voice barely a whisper. No, I won't. The static hum grew furious, reaching a pitch that made Nihal's ears ache painfully. The window pane next to him began to vibrate so intensely that small spiderweb cracks appeared at the corners of the frame. Outside, through the fractured glass, dozens of pale, waterlogged hands began to emerge from the fog, their split nails scratching frantically against the outside of the bus. Nihal pressed his back so hard against the corner of the seat that the metal frame dug into his shoulder blades. He clamped his hands over his ears, but it did nothing to muffle the chorus of demands echoing directly inside his skull. Open it. Let the dark air in. Complete the crossing. The tall, geometric entity in the trench coat leaned closer. Its presence was suffocating. The absolute freezing void radiating from its crystalline body caused frost to rapidly bloom across the back of the seat, creeping toward Nihal's hands like tiny silver spiderwebs. The sub-audible hum grew so intense that Nihal felt a warm trickle of blood escape his left nostril. Crack. A louder, sharper sound cut through the mental static. It was deafening. The spiderweb fractures at the corners of the window pane widened. Slowly, outside, the dozens of pale, waterlogged hands were not just scratching anymore. They were throwing their weight against the exterior of the bus. The glass flexed inward under the pressure, and Nihal could see their featureless faces pressed flat against the pane, shifting and morphing like melting wax. No! Nihal screamed aloud this time, his voice cracking with pure desperation. I won't open it. Go away. But there was no response. Suddenly, the mechanical whine of the bus's transmission roared back to life. The ancient engine let out a violent metallic shudder, that shook the entire chassis. Clunk. The gears shifted aggressively, and the bus abruptly lurched forward, accelerating away from the brutalist concrete bunker of Blackwood Hollow. The sudden momentum threw the impossibly tall entity off balance, and it stumbled. Its long, segmented arms snapped back beneath its coat, and the crushing mental pressure suffocating Nihal's mind instantly vanished. The entity did not fall. It simply glided backward down the aisle, its geometric shards clinking together like broken glass thrown into a tumbler. It retreated toward the front doors, which finally hissed open as the bus sped down the dark road. Without looking back, the creature stepped out into the rushing wind and vanished into the enveloping fog. Nihal collapsed sideways onto the seat, gasping for air, as if he had just been pulled from the bottom of a frozen lake. He wiped the blood from his lip with the sleeve of his jacket, his body shaking uncontrollably. He looked at the window next to him. The glass was ruined, covered in deep structural fractures, and stained with the greasy, dark residue of the things outside. But it had held. The boundary between the inside of the bus and whatever lay in the fog remained intact. For now, the cabin lights flickered violently, shifting from their sickly yellow-blue to a dim, emergency orange. The bus was moving faster now, the engine screaming at a pitch that suggested it was running beyond its mechanical limits. The pine trees outside were no longer distinct shapes. They were a continuous, dark blur rushing past. Nihal looked toward the front of the cabin. There was only one passenger left. The last figure sat in the very front row, right behind the driver's partition. Unlike the others, this passenger was small, wrapped in a faded vintage wool shawl. As Nihal watched, the figure slowly turned its head around. It didn't just turn its neck. Its head spun a full 180 degrees to face the back of the bus, while its torso remained completely still, facing forward. Through the dim orange light, Nihal saw the face of an elderly woman. Her skin was gray and leathery, and her eyes were entirely absent, replaced by two hollow, dark holes that leaked a thick, silver fluid down her cheeks. Despite her horrific appearance, Her expression was one of profound, tragic pity. She didn't speak into his mind. She spoke aloud, her voice thin, papery, and trembling with a terrifying weight. "You did well, child," she whispered, her words carrying clearly over the roaring engine. "But the highway does not end. The driver has no destination, and the final station requires a toll that cannot be paid in coin." Nihal swallowed hard, his throat dry as ash. What are you people?" he asked. "Where's this bus going?" The old woman's hollow sockets seemed to widen, reflecting the dim emergency lights of the cabin. "We are the ones who fell asleep on the late-night lines," she said softly. "The ones who looked out the window for too long. Look ahead, child. We are approaching the terminus." Nihal slowly turned his gaze past her, looking through the front windshield of the speeding bus. The fog ahead was parting slowly, but it didn't reveal a city, a station, or a road. The highway simply ended, crumbling away into a massive, infinite abyss of swirling, static blue cosmic clouds. And the bus was hurtling straight toward the edge at full speed. The sight of the approaching abyss sent a jolt of pure electric terror through Nihal's veins. The highway didn't just end. It was torn apart, its jagged concrete edges suspended in midair, crumbling into a vast, swirling vortex of cosmic blue static. There was no sky, no ground, just an infinite expanse of empty space lit by the eerie, pulsing light of dead stars. And the bus wasn't slowing down. "Stop the bus!" Nihal screamed, slamming his hands against the back of the seat in front of him. "Hey, driver! Stop the damn bus!" The driver remained completely motionless, hands gripped tightly onto the large steering wheel. From the back, Nihal could see that the driver's uniform was fused with the seat itself, the dark fabric melting into the cracked leather like rotting vines. Desperate, Nihal lunged out of the rear seat and sprinted down the narrow aisle. The emergency orange lights overhead buzzed aggressively, casting long, frantic shadows against the metal walls. As he passed the elderly woman in the front row, her head remained spun around, her hollow, tear-stained sockets tracking his movement with an expression of quiet despair. "It is futile, child," she whispered, her papery voice echoing above the roar of the engine. "The engine runs on the regrets of the lost. It doesn't know how to stop." Nihal ignored her. He reached the front partition and grabbed the driver's shoulder, pulling back with all his might. The driver's body easily rolled backward, detaching from the steering wheel with a sickening wet tear. The uniform collapsed into an empty heap on the floorboard. There was no man inside. The clothes were filled with nothing but cold, gray ash, and a swarm of tiny, glowing blue insects that scattered across the dashboard. The steering wheel was spinning on its own, locked onto a trajectory straight into the cosmic void. Through the massive front windshield, the edge of the broken highway was now less than 100 yards away. The crushing gravitational pull of the blue vortex began to lift the front tires of the bus, causing the steering column to shake violently. Nihal scrambled to find the brake pedal, throwing his entire weight onto the heavy metal lever. It went completely slack, sinking to the floor without resistance. The lines had been cut, or perhaps they had never existed at all. Outside the cracked windows, the storm of pale, waterlogged hands returned. They weren't just scratching now. They were climbing onto the hood, pressing their featureless, melting faces against the front windshield, their hollow sockets glowing with the same static blue light as the abyss below. They were welcoming the bus home. Nihal backed away from the windshield, his breath coming in short, suffocating gasps. He looked back down the long, empty aisle toward the very rear of the bus, the last window seat where his journey had started. The spiderweb cracks on his original window were pulsing. A faint, rhythmic hum began to vibrate through the shattered glass, and inside his mind, a new voice echoed. It wasn't a threat. It was a cold, absolute realization. The bus wasn't taking him to the abyss. The bus was the abyss, collecting passengers one by one until the cabin was full. The front bumper of the vehicle crossed the threshold of the broken highway. The roaring sound of the engine instantly died, replaced by a heavy, terrifying weightlessness as the entire chassis began to tilt forward into the blue neon fog. The sensation of falling was not a violent plunge, but a slow, suffocating descent into a frictionless vacuum. As the bus tipped over the edge of the shattered highway, gravity ceased to exist. Nihal's feet left the metal floorboards. He floated in the center aisle, suspended in the dim orange emergency glow, while all around him, the ash of the phantom driver drifted like a dark constellation of dead stars. Outside the windows, the world had dissolved completely. The concrete, the pine trees, and the roads were gone, replaced by an infinite, undulating sea of static blue cosmic clouds. Clink, clink, clink. The sound came from the front row. Nihal twisted his body in midair to look. The elderly woman with the spinning head was no longer a person. Her gray, leathery skin was peeling away in large, papery flakes, revealing that her underlying structure was made of the same dark, geometric shards as the tall entity from Blackwood Hollow. Her hollow sockets flared with brilliant blue light as her form began to unravel into the air. "We are not victims, child," her voice echoed, no longer coming from her mouth, but vibrating through the very metal structure of the floating bus. "We are the components. Every line needs its track. Every vessel needs its crew." The bus shuddered violently as it drifted deeper into the blue vortex. From the walls, the ceiling, and beneath the seats, hundreds of glowing, translucent hands began to materialize, not from the outside, but bleeding through the interior metalwork itself. They reached out into the empty air, their movements fluid, almost graceful, like sea anemones catching a current. One of the translucent hands brushed against Nihal's floating jacket. Where it touched, the fabric instantly froze, turning into a brittle, dark blue crystalline substance. Panic flared anew. Nihal thrashed in the weightless air, kicking against the high-backed seats to propel himself toward the back of the bus. The rear, the last window seat, was the only place where the hands hadn't yet emerged. He slammed against the back row, his hands scrambling to grip the frozen metal frame of his original seat. He looked at the window next to him and saw something that made his blood run cold. The deep spiderweb cracks in the glass were no longer dark. They were glowing with a fierce, blinding blue luminescence that pulsed in perfect synchronization with his own heartbeat. He looked down at his right hand, the one pressing against the vibrating pain. The skin on his knuckles was turning a pale, waterlogged white. Beneath the surface, he could see tiny, microscopic shards of glass shifting, rearranging themselves under his flesh to match the static blue frequency of the abyss outside. The transformation was painless, accompanied only by a deep, numbing cold that began to creep up his forearm. The voice of the bus returned, a collective chorus of everyone who had ever fallen asleep on the late-night lines. The registry is nearly complete, it said. Take your position, Nihal. Look out the window. Look out at the line. Driven by a horrifying, irresistible compulsion, Nihal turned his face toward the fractured glass. He didn't see the cosmic void anymore. Through the blue static, he saw another highway, wet with rain, shrouded in heavy fog, and standing under a rusting, skeletal bus shelter on the side of that distant road was another lonely figure, shivering in the cold, waiting for a ride. The numbing cold crawled past Nihal's elbow, turning his veins into lines of glowing, static blue frost. He could feel his individual thoughts beginning to splinter, dissolving into the vast, interconnected network of the bus itself. He was no longer just a passenger named Nihal. He was becoming a gear, a pane of glass, a voice in the chorus. He stared through the fractured window at the lonely figure standing under the rusted bus shelter on that distant, foggy road. The stranger was shivering, checking a dead phone, looking desperately into the dark for a sign of salvation. Nihal tried to scream, to smash his fist against the pane and warn the traveler away. But his arm wouldn't obey. The skin of his hand had completely fused with the glass, the geometric crystalline shards rewriting his biology, until his fingers became nothing more than a pale, translucent silhouette etched into the window. The floating bus began to align itself with the distant road. The cosmic blue abyss slowly faded, bleeding back into the familiar, depressing reality of a wet European highway. The weightlessness vanished. With a heavy metallic thud, The tires of the ancient transit vehicle slammed back onto solid asphalt. The emergency orange lights overhead flickered once and died, replaced by the familiar, sickly neon blue luminescence. The bus began to decelerate, its brakes letting out that same high-pitched, agonizing shriek that echoed through the quiet night. It rolled past the dark pine trees, cutting through the thick layer of grime-scented fog, until it crawled to a halt right in front of the isolated shelter. PSSTTTTT. The pneumatic front doors hissed open with a dry, screeching complaint. From his permanent position in the last window seat, Nihal couldn't turn his head. He could only watch through the glass as the lonely stranger outside looked up, a look of profound relief washing over their tired face at the sight of a late-night bus. As the new passenger stepped onto the first stair, the collective chorus inside Nihal's mind opened its mouth to welcome them. His own stolen voice leading the whisper, "Step inside. There is always room in the back." The strangers stepped onto the bus, their wet boots making a dull, squelching sound against the rubber floor mat of the entryway. It was a young woman. She was wearing a rain-soaked yellow raincoat, her dark hair plastered against her forehead, and her shoulders were hunched tightly against the chill that radiated from the interior of the vehicle. She paused for a fraction of a second at the top of the steps, looking toward the driver's seat. From his prison at the back of the bus, Nihal tried to scream. He tried to force his lungs to expand, to rip his throat open, and tell her to run back into the fog. But his lungs were no longer made of tissue. They were empty chambers lined with cold, geometric glass. The only sound that escaped him was a faint, high-pitched whistle, like wind rushing through a narrow crack in a window. The driver's uniform, now sitting upright again, and filled with a fresh, shifting mass of those tiny, glowing blue insects, did not move. A gloved hand simply rose from the armrest, pointing a stiff, mechanical finger toward the back of the cabin. The girl let out a long, shaky breath, her mist blooming in the air. "Thanks," she muttered, her voice trembling slightly. "I thought I'd be stuck out there all night." She began to walk down the narrow aisle, As she passed the first few rows, the silent passengers, the components as the old woman had called them, slowly began to adjust their positions. Their movements were completely silent. They didn't look at her with human eyes. Instead, the faint, neon blue emergency lights overhead reflected off the polished, crystalline surfaces hidden beneath their clothes. Nihal watched her approach, his vision fracturing into thousands of tiny, repeating hexagonal tiles. Every step she took closer to the rear of the bus felt like a heavy weight pressing down on his chest. She was looking for an empty row. She passed the middle of the bus, where the air was noticeably colder. She shivered, pulling her yellow raincoat tighter around her body. "Is the heater broken?" she asked aloud, looking around for any sign of life from the other commuters. Nobody answered. The only response was the steady, hypnotic thrum of the ancient engine beneath their feet. A sound that was slowly matching the rhythm of her own heartbeat, binding her to the vehicle's frequency. Finally, she reached the absolute rear. She stopped right in front of Nihal's row. Because of the geometric transformation, she didn't see a living man sitting across the aisle. To her, the last window seat on the right looked completely empty, save for a faint, dark smudge on the glass that vaguely resembled the silhouette of a human head. She sighed with relief, tossing her wet backpack onto the empty seat across the aisle. Directly through the space where Nihal's phantom legs were suspended in the air, she slid into the last window seat on the left, leaning her head against the cold, vibrating glass. PSSTTTTT. The front doors slammed shut with a definitive airlock seal. The gears ground together with a violent, metallic shriek, and the bus lurched forward, pulling away from the shelter and diving back into the endless, suffocating wall of European fog. The trap had reset. The cycle was spinning again. Nihal felt his consciousness slipping further away, sinking into the iron floorboards of the bus. He could feel the road beneath the tires. He could feel the rust eating away at the chassis. He could feel the cold rain washing over the roof. He was no longer a passenger. He was the vehicle. And next to him, across the narrow aisle, the girl in the yellow raincoat closed her eyes, letting the rhythmic swaying of the bus pull her into a deep, inescapable sleep. Outside her window, the fog began to thicken, and from the darkness of the highway, the first pale, waterlogged hand emerged from the mist, reaching out for the glass. The girl's breathing slowed, stabilizing into the heavy, rhythmic cadence of a deep, dreamless sleep. Across the aisle, Nihal, or what was left of his mind within the metal frame of the bus, felt her presence tethering to the vehicle. The thrum, thrum, thrum of the engine grew deeper, expanding until it resonated inside the very cabin air like a low, vibrating hum. Outside, the darkness grew absolute. The highway lines vanished, swallowed by a shifting, liquid fog that seemed to bleed directly from the tires. Top, top, top. The sound was brittle, sharp, against the left window pane this time. The girl didn't stir, but her brow furrowed in her sleep. Outside her glass, a pale, waterlogged hand with split, mud-caked fingernails pressed flat against the surface, leaving an oily smudge that glowed with a faint, neon blue static. Slowly, another hand appeared, then another. Within minutes, the entire left side of the bus was lined with shifting, melting silhouettes, their empty, smoke-filled sockets staring directly at the sleeping passenger in the yellow raincoat. Inside Nihal's fracturing consciousness, a realization flickered like a dying bulb. The bus wasn't just a trap, it was a harvester. It traveled through the blind spots of the world, the lonely midnight routes where people slipped through the cracks of reality and traded their flesh for crystalline energy to feed the endless loop of the line. Suddenly, the overhead emergency lights flared back to life, shifting from the sickly neon blue to a harsh, blinding emergency orange. The vehicle let out a violent, mechanical groan. The steering column up front spun wildly on its own, locking into a sharp, drifting turn. Through the fractured front windshield, the fog parted once more, revealing the jagged, crumbling edges of the broken highway, the massive, infinite abyss of swirling, static blue cosmic clouds was waiting below, pulsing like a living heart. The bus rushed toward the edge. Gravity began to warp, lifting the heavy backpack across the aisle into the air, where it floated weightlessly alongside the drifting gray ash of the driver's uniform. The sudden weightlessness jarred the girl awake. Her eyes snapped open, reflecting the blinding orange glow of the cabin. What's happening? She gasped, her hands frantically reaching out for the seat handles as her body began to lift off the cushion. She looked toward the front, seeing the empty driver's seat and the swirling cosmic void rushing toward them. She screamed, a raw, terrified human sound that shattered the oppressive silence of the bus. She scrambled to her feet, trying to run toward the exit, but the air was thick, like moving through deep water. As she thrashed in the center aisle, her eyes finally fell on the last window seat on the right, directly at Nihal's translucent, crystalline silhouette etched into the glass. For a terrifying second, their eyes met. She didn't see a smudge. She saw the hollow, desperate face of the boy who had sat there before her, his fingers permanently fused into the structural fractures of the pain. "Help me!" she cried, reaching her hand out toward his row. But before her fingers could touch the frozen metal frame, the front bumper of the transit vehicle crossed the threshold of the solid world. The roar of the engine died instantly, replaced by the terrifying, absolute silence of the infinite descent. The descent into the cosmic abyss was an agonizing stretch of warp time. The yellow raincoat the girl wore seemed to bleed its color into the darkness, turning a sickly, translucent gray as the vacuum of the static blue void stripped away the remnants of the physical world. She hovered in the center aisle, her chest heaving, her eyes wide with a terror that had passed the point of tears. Nihal watched her from his permanent position within the right window pane. The transition was accelerating now. The microscopic, geometric glass shards that had claimed his arm were rapidly migrating across his collarbone, locking his neck in place and anchoring his thoughts into the cold, immutable iron of the bus chassis. The girl looked at her own hands as they floated in the weightless cabin. The skin on her fingertips was peeling away, not revealing blood or bone, but the same dark, interlocking crystalline shards that formed the structure of the entities they had encountered along the route. "We are almost home," the collective chorus whispered within her mind. Nihal's voice now fully laced into the synchronized frequency. The toll has been accepted. With a sudden, violent deceleration that felt like crashing into a wall of solid ice, the weightlessness vanished. The bus didn't hit concrete. It struck a massive obsidian platform that floated in the literal heart of the cosmic vortex. The sound was deafening, a symphonic screech of twisting metal and breaking glass. Crack. The fractured window next to Nihal shattered completely, but the shards didn't fall. They expanded outward, weaving themselves into a massive, towering mirror that rose from the floorboards to the ceiling. The emergency orange lights died. Forever. The cabin was plunged into the absolute brilliance of the static blue core outside. The girl fell heavily to the floor, coughing up thin, silver fluid. She forced herself to her knees, looking up at the massive mirror that now occupied the entire rear wall of the bus. In the reflection, she didn't see herself, nor did she see the ruined interior of the transit vehicle. She saw the highway bus shelter. She saw the pouring rain of Western Europe, and standing inside that reflection, shivering under the rusted skeletal frame, was Nihal, intact, human. His dead smartphone in his pocket, looking desperately into the dark fog for a late-night line to take him home. The registry requires a balance. The old woman's voice echoed one last time from the empty front seats. Her form completely dissolved into the air. One enters the circuit so the other may return to the platform. A soul for a soul. A passenger for a component. The girl realized the trap too late. She reached out toward the mirror. Her hand now completely transformed into a jagged, geometric blade of black glass. No! Swap it back. Please. But the crystalline frequency had reached her throat. Her voice fractured into a high-pitched, mechanical whistle. Her body stiffened, her joints bending, with a sickening, disjointed snap. Her legs locked into the iron floorboards, forcing her down into the last window seat on the left. Her eyes widened into featureless, hollow sockets, leaking a steady stream of silver smoke against the pane. Across the aisle, the mirror rippled, like water. Nihal felt the numbing cold violently ripped from his consciousness. The geometric shards vanished from his veins, replaced by the sudden, burning rush of hot human blood. His lungs expanded, drawing in a massive, desperate gulp of freezing, damp air. He blinked hard against the blinding light. When he opened his eyes, the static blue void was gone. The obsidian platform was gone. He was standing on wet asphalt, the freezing rain of the city outskirts soaking through his damp jacket. His boots were firmly planted on the concrete of the highway shelter. He let out a ragged sob, pulling his phone from his pocket. The screen flashed to life. 12:45 a.m. The heavy, rhythmic thrum, thrum, thrum of an ancient engine echoed from the fog. Two sickly, yellow headlights dissolved into the mist approaching the shelter. The archaic, dilapidated transit bus crawled to a halt right in front of him, its pneumatic doors screeching open with a dry, welcoming hiss. Nihal stood frozen, his breath blooming into small white clouds. He looked toward the back of the empty neon blue cabin. Pressed flat against the last window seat on the left was a pale, translucent hand with split, mud-caked fingernails scratching frantically at the glass, leaving an oily smudge behind. And next to it, on the right window pane, a faint, dark smudge, shaped like a human head, seemed to stare directly into his soul. Nihal backed away into the pouring rain, letting the dead phone slip from his fingers into the wet mud. The bus waited for a long, silent minute. Then the doors hissed shut, the gears ground together, and the vehicle crawled back into the enveloping fog, searching the midnight lines for the next passenger to complete the loop.